He's written for all the media from New York Times to Playboy. He's been a contributing editor for American Conservative Magazine, as well as The Freeman, and he's a regular contributor to The Future of Freedom magazine. The Wall Street Journal called Bovard the roving inspector general of the modern state. The New York Times tagged him as an anti-czar czar, and a Washington Post columnist called him a one-man truth squad. His writings have been publicly denounced by the chief of the FBI. It goes on. Okay, so the Secretary of Labor, the DEA, FEMA, as well as the Sierra Club, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Washington Post, which he did publish for, or did get published in. So anyone who's been denounced by such high-profile organizations deserves your attention, and now he has it. Please join me in welcoming James Bovard to the stage to discuss Libertarian Hooliganism.
All right. Thanks very much. I appreciate that. Thanks very much for the kind. Is it my card? Thanks very much for the kind words. I appreciate that. It's fun to come up here to talk in New Hampshire about hooligan attitudes towards government and freedom. Is the mic on? It's working? Okay, fine. Sorry. There are a lot of good hooligans here, and because I hear this stuff the Free State Project is doing, and it's just it's great to see so many people already pushing back against government. Since this is New Hampshire, I assume everybody here loves Boston, right? No? Okay, I was wrong. You know, I mentioned Boston because it had a formative influence on my political thinking. My 1977 move to Boston was kind of like when the Beverly Hillbillies moved to California, except I did not arrive with $80 million in the bank. I dropped out of college after a couple of years. I decided I wanted to be a writer. I thought Boston would be a good place to find opportunity to let my talents ripen. I figured I could easily sell articles in Boston. I was wrong. So I ended up doing all kinds of jobs to pay the rent. I worked as a Santa Claus at Filene's. I worked as a giant Beatrix Potter rabbit at Filene's in Manchester. And I also worked as a Kelly girl where I suffered sexual harassment. But that's too painful to talk about. But the proudest thing on my proudest achievement in the Boston period of my life was doing path-breaking work for the Harvard Business School. I was living in Boston during the Great Storm of 1978, and at that point I was running slightly behind on my rent, and I was literally down to my last dollar, and things were so bad I'd stopped buying beer. So the snowstorm hit, and someone told me the Harvard Business School is hiring snow shovelers $4 an hour. So I said, okay, this is my chance. So I worked like 43 hours in the next 2 days, caught up on the rent, and almost had a good attitude about Boston for a while. One of the attractions that Massachusetts had to me was it was home to two of my favorite early philosophers, Thoreau and Emerson. I was especially impressed by Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, in which he wrote, "I quietly declare war on the state of Massachusetts in my own fashion, though I will still make what use and get what advantage of her that I can." His essay was sparked by the night he spent in a Concord jail after he refused to pay the poll tax, which helped finance the war with Mexico. He was released after a friend paid the tax after one night. I didn't have anything against poll taxes. Those taxes had been abolished like 100 years before I was born. And it was too late to protest the war in Mexico. But anyhow, so it was March 78. I used to hitchhike up and down the East Coast, going back to see some friends in Southwest Virginia and Boston. And I was visiting a friend in Washington, D.C., and her family had a very formal breakfast, so I couldn't get out hitchhiking until middle of the day. Bad timing. And it was a very sunny day, so there was this is middle of March, and down in the D.C. area, it was beautiful weather, sort of like it is today. And up here, well, I hitchhiked, I made it up to New Jersey, and late in the afternoon, I ride with a guy named Greek who was going to New Hampshire. Greek was the best storyteller I met east of the Mississippi. He was a very charming fellow. His truck, it was kind of ratty and old, and the fenders were held on with duct tape. And every 25 miles, he had to stop to pour a couple quarts of oil in the engine because it was overheating. But so he was heading on to New Hampshire. He dropped me off at the Massachusetts Turnpike entrance about an hour west of Boston about midnight. Unfortunately, the weather, it wasn't sunny anymore. It wasn't warm anymore. There was winds and howling storm. So I stood out 10 yards in front of the toll booth line for about half an hour, and only 3 cars stopped, and only 3 cars passed by. And the cars did not have an excuse not to give me a ride because I was not wearing a convict suit. I wasn't threatening, but the cars did not even slow down enough that I could cuss at them. So, as much as I enjoyed Mother Nature, I had to hunch the night was not going to get any warmer or more pleasant. The wind was howling. I had no winter sleeping gear and nothing to keep me warm except shop-worn blasphemies. So I noticed, there were 5 toll booths there. 2 of them had lights on, and the other 3 were dark. So I said, So I circled around the woods and came up on the far side of the one closest to the road, and then gave a little push to the door. And the door popped right open. And then I stepped inside, and then lo and behold, there on the floor was a space heater. So I was thinking, hey, this is good. So I just I stuck my head up to see if anybody noticed me come in, and they hadn't. So I just kind of slipped on in. And, I was really tempted to turn on the light and try and start collecting tolls. Except that this was an entrance booth for the turnpike. And it might have been suspicious asking people to pay before they got on the turnpike. So considering that I might have been arrested for trespassing at any moment, I slept well. After I woke up at dawn, I circled around back in the woods and went out hitchhiking, and started hitchhiking again, and actually got a ride with a couple of guys who were driving a pickup truck, and they were drinking beer already like at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they said, well, you could ride in the back. And I said, all right, fine, I'll do it for an hour. So anyhow, but interesting. In civil disobedience, after Thoreau was released from his night in jail, he said, a change had to my eyes come over the scene, greater than any that mere time could effect. I saw yet more distinctively the state in which I lived. Well, I had no such epiphany after my night in the toll booth. I had been cussing government going back since I had my first peach fuzz. And living in Massachusetts had only confirmed my contempt for all politicians and bureaucrats. One of the influences, I was born in Iowa, I was raised in the Shenandoah Valley, and one of the most formative jobs I had was working for the Virginia Highway Department. I actually worked alongside a convict road gang and learned a fair amount about them learned about the drug war from them. But I did various things with that job. I would dig potholes, I would cut brush, but the thing I liked most of all was wielding a chainsaw, which was great training to become a journalist later on. Now, things were different back in the 1970s. I was 16 at that point, and I would hold up traffic while the other guys in the crew pretended to work. Hot days in the summer, some drivers would come by and just kind of throw me a cold beer. And that was, life is good. Life is good. Nowadays, if somebody did that, there'd probably be a SWAT team that would descend. Maybe even a drone attack. One of the jobs I had there was doing roadkill ride-alongs. And I was riding along with a guy by the name of Bud. He was amiable, jelly-bellied truck driver. He was always chewing the cheapest, nastiest cigar ever made, something called Swisher Sweets. And, I was trying not to put on airs around because the cigars I smoked cost 5 cents more. I didn't want to sound like a cigar snob, but Swisher Sweets, I recognized even back then, they were horrible. One of the things we were supposed to do as the roadkill, we were supposed to ride up and we saw a dead deer, a raccoon, whatever, along the road, get it out of the road and bury it alongside the road, dig a hole and bury it. Well, that was inefficient. But he appreciated things. So what we would do, we would get our shovels underneath the deer carcass, whatever. We'd wait till nobody was driving by, then we'd heave it into the bushes. It was important not to let the job crowd the time for smoking. I was assigned to a work crew that was probably the biggest slackers south of the Mason-Dixon. I don't know why they chose me for the crew, but you know. Working slowly to slipshod standards was their code of honor. And anybody who worked harder was seen as a nuisance or a menace. One of the things which I learned from that job was how not to shovel. It's easy. Any yucca-puck can grunt and heave material from spot A to spot B, but it takes an art in order to avoid doing that with grace. For instance, I mean, it was important to have the shovel kind of pushed up against your belt, and it was important not to have both hands in your pocket at the same time. Because as soon as you had both hands in your pocket, people said, government employee. You know, those hateful stereotypes. So you just kind of lean and you kind of look at the work and, you try and show the same keen concentration that a falcon does before it swoops down on its prey. And it's the same with getting ready to shovel, but you never quite make that shovel load. So it was about the only time of day that people really sweat there was in the half hour before the job ended, because we'd all go back to this work area and it didn't have a clock. And people would sit there literally for the last 10 or 15 minutes on dead silence, just kind of waiting for one of the senior guys to signal, okay, now it's 5 o'clock, and they'd all jump up and run out the door. And that was the most activity I saw out of anybody the whole summer. And it was interesting, at the same time I was working there, I was working on Friday nights at a book bindery, unloading trucks full of books. And it was a fascinating contrast, because working for the government, the whole goal was to conserve energy. Whereas working at the book bindery, I was paid a flat fee in cash, and so the goal was to conserve time. And it really vivified how working with the government, it becomes a virtue to kill time. And it just fundamentally changes your attitude towards life. 19th century humorist Josh Billings defined a fanatic as someone who does what God would do if God knew the facts of the matter. Now, similarly, the writing I do has been driven by a faith that people would be outraged about being misgoverned once they knew the facts of the matter. And once people would recognize the danger of government, they'd be far more likely to make a vigorous effort to save their own freedom. Well, that was a theory, anyhow. I appreciate that list of denunciations at the start. People sometimes ask if it's upsetting to me if the government gets angry about an article I've written. I can usually hold back the tears pretty well. It's just painful in the sense that they never quite get the approval that I've always been seeking. Part of it, I guess, part of my attitude was I was raised on a mountainside in an area that was very rough and tumble at that point. I learned to love brawling from an early age, either boxing in my backyard or playing middle linebacker on the football team or doing weightlifting contests or tussling with the police at times. And nowadays, it's often tussling with government agencies. And it's interesting, it's a really fatal bias if journalists want to get along with the government agency which they're writing about, because you've kind of like started out selling your soul to the devil. I've had obviously a lot of conflicts over the years. One story is when I was working on a book in the 1990s called The Fair Trade Fraud. Trade was a really big issue back in the early 1990s. Some of y'all might recall, I think Pat Buchanan won the 1992 primary here, or was it the 1996 primary he won? Was it 92? Well, he was either first or second in New Hampshire, and he was riding the trade issue really big. And so and people like Pat Buchanan were saying that America was being victimized by its free trade policies. Well, I was puzzled because, the U.S. Tariff Code had 8,000 different categories. Almost none of them were free trade. And they had all these different tariff levels. And the tariffs I knew about, a lot of the tariffs were high. Like orange juice was 40%. Shoes were over 70% in many cases. But a lot of the tariffs were listed in kilograms or pounds or dozens. And my hunch was those were the highest tariffs. And in order to attack the U.S. trade policy, I wanted to find out what those tariffs were. So I called up the U.S. Tariff Commission, the U.S. International Trade Commission, the U.S. Trade Representative, tried to get these numbers. And they all said, those numbers don't exist. Nobody has them. And I said, yeah. Anyhow, but so I was taking a break at one point. I was knocking around Europe. And I visited Switzerland, where they had where the headquarters of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs was, which is now known as the World Trade Organization. It's kind of in this big old huge castle, and they had all these international bureaucrats that were trying to prevent trade wars. They were basically trying to do good. There's a lot of questions about some of their nits and butts, but anyhow. So I went there. I was going to interview some of their people on some of the textile trade import quotas we had. And going there, caught the bus there, and then showed up, and they had a couple guards at the front, and it was almost like going through TSA is nowadays, except that they didn't squeeze my balls. It was a very intensive search. It's practically, they had the same kind of shoulder bag then that I had now, and they kind of almost shook it down. I was waiting for them to make me take my socks off, but I didn't have to do that. So I was surprised, because I wasn't expecting that at all. So I went, I interviewed the folks, and then I was done. I was heading out, and I was going down this long hallway, and I saw up ahead there was this little cardboard table, like with all these like brick-like, very thick documents stacked up on it. And I was thinking, And then I got a little bit closer, and then I saw on the name of the door was the Office of Tariff Affairs and Tariff Negotiations for the International Trade Agreement. And I got a little bit, as I walked a little more, I saw that the documents had on big stamp on them, secret. And then a little closer, I saw it said, property of the U.S. government, tariff level bargaining proposal for March 15th, 1990. It would have been rude to stop and look at it, because I was a guest. So, I didn't stop. I didn't even break stride. I just kind of slipped it up and popped it in the bag. And it was a little tricky, because it was literally 700 pages. And it wasn't like you were scooping a memo off somebody's desk and just kind of putting it in your back of your pants. So I just kept up my stride, and then I got to the exit thing, and the guards were there, and I'm thinking, like, will they search me on the way out? This could be really interesting. And so they were, Switzerland, so I said something to them in either bad German or bad French. And they said, oh, here's another American who thinks he can speak the language here. So I said, yeah, go ahead, fine. So I exited, and I hopped back on the bus to get back to the hotel. And I opened it up, and I was thinking, holy Shazam, this is the mother lode I was looking for, because it had all the numbers. All the numbers. So I carried that around for another week in Europe. I had a Eurail pass, and it was kind of like carrying a cinder block. But it was worth it. I got back to Washington, D.C., and called up the tariff affairs expert at the U.S. Trade Representative Office. Now, I'd called and talked to her a couple times before, and for some reason, she always sounded colicky when I called to talk. And I said, I've got some numbers which I need to verify. She said, So I said the tariff level on code level 6924, that's tobacco, that's 458%, right? Long pause. Okay, the tariff on code level number 16.4 that's watches, that's 157%. Pause. And then she says, where did you get that information? I said, it was from the U.S. GATT proposal on March 15th. She said, that's secret information. I said, yeah, it's stamped confidential on every page, but I still have to confirm it. I've forgotten if she cussed me out or if she just slammed down the phone. That was before caller ID was widespread, so people would answer my calls then. After caller ID, it's kind of like, oh, it's that bastard, nobody's here. It's interesting. It's not something that y'all have so much in New Hampshire, but some places where I talk to people about freedom, they're almost paralyzed by a fear of the state, fear of government, things like that. And there was an experience I had about a dozen years ago back in the mountains of western North Carolina, close to Asheville. I was traveling with my wife at that point, now my ex-wife. And, wives have a habit of having these tour books where they find chateaus. This would be a nice chateau to go to. So we're going around the backwoods. We're trying to find the damn thing. And I was just kind of striking out. And I finally pulled up in front of this hardware store. I was going to ask directions in there. And within 30 seconds after I pulled up, this big old guy, bald-headed guy, comes bounding out of the store. Harley says, "What part of Maryland are you from?" And I said, "Rockville." And he started chatting me up. He told me he was originally from Maryland 20 years ago, that he'd moved down here, and he told me how much money he lost gambling at the Indian casino nearby, and all kinds of other details, and some of his scruffy neighbors. And after about 15 minutes, he paused, and he admitted that he thought I was an undercover federal agent. And I said, "Well, why would you think that?" He said, "Well, you have Maryland license plates and you're driving a black car." So, and he said, "And cars like yours usually have hidden tracking devices on the underside and the back of the car." I said, "You want to take a look?" And he said, yeah, that's a good idea. So I said, "Okay, go." So he went behind the car, and he pawed around for a couple minutes, and he didn't find anything, so he popped this up, and he decided I was an okay guy. And it was interesting. He's a truck driver. He drove 18-wheelers up and down the East Coast. He and I talked for 2 hours. And it was interesting because he actually knew a lot of the details of Ruby Ridge that for some reason people inside the Beltway never know. I wrote a lot about that. I was denounced by the FBI for that, and my ego never recovered. But part of what was interesting talking to this guy was he was there in the woods. Well, they're in the mountains there. They had... Back in the mountains there, the FBI had descended upon them about a year earlier because Eric Rudolph was rumored to be hiding in that part of western North Carolina. So you had the FBI come in, and what the FBI did was go in and just take over everything. They would go to motels, and they'd throw out all the guests saying, "Okay, everybody has to leave right now." They would go in, they would dominate restaurants and stuff like that. So pretty soon, people in North Carolina would simply tell them, "No federal agents allowed in here. The FBI agents are not allowed to eat here." And the FBI had bragged when they sent 200 agents down to where Eric Rudolph was supposedly hiding, that they were going to, it was their best and brightest. He didn't have a chance. Well, the FBI completely lost the support of the local people there, and the FBI didn't find squat. And people just kind of brushed them aside. People had such a healthy disdain for the FBI. Eric Rudolph was found a couple years later by a deputy sheriff. The feds did nothing to help it. But I had to think about that episode, though, because it was kind of symptomatic, because in a lot of my dealings with federal agencies in D.C., the federal agencies think I'm a redneck. And then I head down to Carolina, and the rednecks think I'm an undercover Fed. I can't get a break. So on that note, I'll draw the curtain of mercy, and if y'all got some questions, I'll be happy to answer a few questions here. So. I want to say the stories here are extracted from the book Public Policy Hooligan, which is available on Amazon. It's an e-book, and it costs less than the price of a good 6-pack of beer. Gardner Goldsmith, a radio host here, internet radio host, Liberty Conspiracy.
Right, thanks for the plug. And thank you for the plug on the show on something else I want to mention here. You talked about, I remember when I first picked up fair trade fraud, which was just fantastic. I had no idea that story was behind the fair trade fraud. That's awesome. It's so cool.
I didn't get indicted for that one.
That's fantastic. Oh, man.
And the statute of limitation has run.
I was wondering about that when you mentioned it.
It's a very careful thing when you're doing this kind of story. That I had to check with lawyers. Okay, the statute of limitation on this is what, and for that is what. Okay, I'm clean.
So there could be another book.
Pipe bombs was one thing. I had a pipe bomb episode when I was in teenage years, and I mean nowadays that would be. Pipe bombs were classified as weapons of mass destruction in the same category as a nuclear bomb. And when I was 15 or 16, I was out with a friend throwing one, and if I'd been caught doing that now, I could be sent to life in prison.
Whoa.
Yeah. So.
No pipe bombs now.
I'm clean. I was a Boy Scout.
Well, I was thinking
I went
about
to the dark side.
how, when I first picked up your work, the Clintons were in office.
Okay.
And then you wrote the Bush Betrayal and so on afterwards. And you had, I think you commented to me once about how you had been embraced by people like Laura Ingraham and people on the conservative or neoconservative side.
It's a long time ago.
Long time ago, exactly. And
that was before 9/11.
Exactly. And
Okay.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about that media embrasure of, because I experienced it on my own radio show. The GM spoke to me and said, no, you're not going to criticize the governor here.
Okay.
And, so I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit about what happened when you started to write about Bush and how things suddenly changed.
Well, it's an interesting pattern. The Fair Trade Fraud was the second book I did, and it got a lot of positive reviews, and it had a good start out of the blocks. The following book was Lost Rights, The Destruction of American Liberty in 1994, which talked about how the government was basically, in some ways, becoming a tyranny and crushing Americans' rights left and right. And I think there was a lot more, people were a lot slower to embrace that. Gordon Liddy embraced it, for which I'm forever grateful. And it had a few reviews, but it got very, very few reviews in the first 6 months, written in print. Wall Street Journal did not review it until like 7 or 8 months after it was out. There were a lot of places that simply would not touch the book because it was almost like I'd gone too far. I mean, I think some people were mortified that I had a discussion of Waco in there. And at that point, we were still, being a good person meant that you accepted the government's story no matter how many times the government changed it. I mean, folks, it's the same with 9/11. I mean, folks are saying that if someone doesn't buy the latest story on 9/11, then they're a conspiracy nut. Well, it's not my fault the government changed the story 27 times. It doesn't mean the government did it, but it means the government's liars. So, so once I started writing about some of the issues of tyranny as opposed to simply bad regulation or subsidies or stuff like that, some editors became a little more leery. And then after 9/11, it was there was a sea change after 9/11. There were a number of conservative places that simply did not want to attack the government at that point, partly because there was a Republican in the White House. That's a huge factor. And also, I mean, there was a sense that if you were criticizing the government abuses here, that you were undermining our defenses there. And there was a suspension of skepticism. And that was part of the reason that George W. was able to seize so much power. And we've seen the same thing in the last 5 or 6 years. You had all these liberals, you've got all this liberal media who are, for some reason, are not willing to criticize and attack Obama the same way that they criticized George Bush. And it's almost as if we're supposed to assume that Obama is an innocent victim of the abuses that have been going on for 5 years under his presidency. So, but yeah, it's interesting. There's this myth that the editors and all this love the truth and that they're willing to sacrifice for it. And some of them are. But throughout my career, it's been challenging to find editors who had a belly for going up to have a conflict with government. Back in the 1980s, there were a lot of editors, op-ed editors, who enjoyed publishing someone who got people all riled up. But in the last 10 years, it's like, we got some letters complaining about your last article. I'm thinking, yeah, well, what did you expect? I mean, it's a sign that maybe someone actually read the newspaper that day. I mean, so many of the newspapers have turned themselves into mush. And that's partly because they're afraid of controversy, and that's part of the reason that people don't read that stuff anymore. I mean, I won't mention any names, but anyhow. So.
Where do you see the future of investigative journalism in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Where do I see the future of investigative journalism? It's going to be a hard fight. I mean, there's been so much transformation. There were places that were doing very good stuff in the past that have some of them lost their spine, some of them lost their budgets, some of them lost their markets. There's other places that are coming up. I mean, it's interesting to see what Glenn Greenwald has done. Very impressive. I'm a huge fan of his. And he was, you know, Glenn Greenwald was hard line on the right side on the war on terror from, I think, late 2005 onwards. He was far ahead of a lot of other folks who got on the bandwagon later. So as far as what's going to happen, I don't know. I mean, it's, my impression is that people don't read as much. And it's frustrating to me that I think that the literary standards have decreased. And people have gotten in the habit of reading online, and what they tend to do is skim the first paragraph, all right, and then jump on to the next story. And folks, I mean, if you're really going to write something that's a investigative piece, and part of what I disliked about investigative journalism when I was first getting into this kind of nook was that a lot of folks would simply show that some law had been violated or some regulation had been violated. Oh my God, that's terrible. What I wanted to do was write about things where the entire government, where the law should be abolished, or where the law should be repealed, or the government program should be abolished. That's why I did a lot of stuff on agriculture programs early on, because it wasn't a question of how you fix the program. No, you abolish it. That's the only way that's the only way to reform most government programs. You abolish them. So. But it's challenging to find editors who have that gumption and have got good visibility. So I don't know. It's in flux. There are some good things coming up. There are some good things that have gone down. Who the hell knows? So.
Do you still live in Maryland? And if so, what the hell?
Now, Jason, I'm assuming that what the hell is a euphemism. Yes, I still live in Maryland. I mean, I'm looking. I mean, I've been down to Asheville a few times and really liked it down there. You know, having spent 8-9 months in Boston, it kind of jaundiced me on New England. I mean, and I come up here, I see 2 feet of snow outside, and first 2 days we had 4 minutes of sunshine. I don't know. It just a little bit. But you know, I was raised in the mountains, so I mean, there's almost a homesick element for the mountains. But I haven't lived in the mountains for many years. No, I'm still in Maryland, but I'm looking to exit. So I mean, Maryland's one of the most corrupt states in the country. I mean, and Maryland has a new gun law that basically. I have to prove that I'm not insane if I want to buy another handgun. And so, you know, I can't buy another handgun because I can never prove that after the stuff I write. So, but no, the state of Virginia is a lot better than Maryland even. So, but Virginia's kind of going to hell, so a little bit. So, But no, I mean, it's neat to come up here and see the vitality and to see the enthusiasm for freedom and to see a lot of folks that are well informed about freedom. Because a lot of places where you go to, people are like, yeah, I'm in favor of freedom. Well, what sort of stuff do you read about? Well, I listen to Rush Limbaugh. Anything else? Well, the Saturday Show too. Okay, well. So, but no, I mean, at some point, I'll exit. So, say what? It's much better up here. Well, there's a lot more freedom here than there is in Maryland. But I mean, that's not much of a compliment. So, I appreciate that. And that's encouraging to see because, crap, I wouldn't see this in Maryland. So, maybe in Western Maryland, people are talking about seceding because it's like there's government employee welfare corridor, Baltimore to Washington. But anyhow, yeah.
So poking the feds in the eye is a dangerous game. Have you ever felt threatened, and how do you weigh your priorities when you decide to publicly expose agencies and the TSA and all these different, criminals, basically?
Have I ever felt threatened? I mean, what's your definition of threatened?
Has it crossed your mind? I mean, you're out there exposing them, and
sure. I mean, I've got a lot of very hostile feedback. Sometimes some death threats kind of coming in. So but someone was saying I was talking to a colleague who had been talking to WikiLeaks, and he was thinking about, he was checking about whether he could handle some of their documents, and he was told that he had to have his computer in what was called a safe room. And I said to him, well, you know, I've got a safe room for my computer. He said, well, what's that? I said, I got my 357 right next to the computer. So, you know, sure, people get angry, people make threats. There was a piece I did after Bush betrayal came out that really, you know, people were talking, I mean, there were some comments about how the atmosphere is so bad right now. It was worse 10 years ago. It was significantly worse 10 years ago. There was still the Iraq War fever then. There was, to see the kind of backlash that was engineered against the Dixie Chicks, that was indicative of how the hostility to freedom back then. Things are not pleasant now, but things were, you know, and you had John Ashcroft, you know, out there saying that, you know, that those who threaten people, the phantoms of lost freedoms, are giving aid and comfort to the enemy. You know, at least Eric Holder doesn't talk that much crap. Eric Holder is bad. You know, he's probably done a lot of things he should be indicted or impeached for, but, you know, at least he doesn't babble like John Ashcroft. So, but there was a story I did. When the Bush betrayal came out in 2004, the publisher had the idea to put an ad on Google so that people could post comments on the publisher's blog site on the book. So a lot of people were seeing the ad who really intensely hated the book. So it made for some great coffee. I mean, a flood of email coming in, and there was a story which I posted online in October 2004. I think the title was, "Bush Supporters Vindicate the President." And part of what was fun was that people had to type in their comments there, and it didn't have a spell checker. It didn't have a spell checker, and people were just raving out of control, and, you know, you should die, you communist bastard. And I'm thinking, okay, I guess I didn't read Feeling Your Pain about Clintons, but anyhow. So, yeah, so that's my roundabout.
In your book, you made some reference to Boston women being uptight. Did any of these threats come from them?
The death threats from the Boston women. No, I haven't had any death threats from Boston women since I moved out of Boston. They're in the Hooligan book. I've got some colorful stuff, and there was one woman I met at the Boston Food Co-op. I've always loved peanut butter, and the Boston Food Co-op was the only place I could find where they had really good natural peanut butter. But in order to get the peanut butter there, you had to work as 4 or 5 whatever hours a month. So I was doing some time there, and met this woman. Her name was Rachel. She was short, dark-haired, dark-eyed. She was cute in a bottle of lightning kind of way. But so she invited me to dinner the next night at her group house. So I went there, brought the 6-pack of beer like you're supposed to do. And she was a sculptor, and she was a head sculptor. And so I stepped into her group house, and she had this thing right above the fireplace. She had 6 of the heads that she had sculpted. And there were all these bald guys that looked like this insanely angry. You know, it should have been a clue. It should have been a clue. But so, you know, we have dinner, and, you know, things are kind of moving along. And she asked if I wanted to see where she did her sculpting. Sure, fine. Well, it turns out I was in the bedroom. And so we went there, and things were kind of heating up a little bit. And then, but then I thought of the old saying, never sleep with anybody crazier than yourself. And so at some point, you know, I'd taken off my boots, whatever, and I kind of said, yeah, I'm not going to go any further. And I could understand if she was perturbed, but she reached over to the side of the mattress and pulled out a 7-inch knife and started screaming and shouting, and it was like a volcano went off. And she was cussing me up and down, and then she started cussing everything else. She might have cussed the Boston subway, I'm not sure. But it was just like this effusion of lava that came out. And, you know, I started to suspect she had anger issues. And it turned out part of the background was she had got an IUD 6 months earlier, and she had not had a chance to test it. And so, I was, you know, there were certain gifts I was born with. One was I've got relatively long arms. And she was short, and so I kind of like, you know, you just kind of act like you're listening patiently, and like, okay. And then at some point, she put down the knife. I grabbed my boots and got the hell out of there. But it was interesting because I went to school for a while in Blacksburg, Virginia Tech, dated women down there, and things were always kind of slow and mellow, and yeah, well, you know, things just kind of went gradual. And then in Boston, you know, the first date, they're trying to kill you. So, you know, yeah, so that's the roundabout answer. That's a great question. I appreciate that.
Well, this is just for the video, right?
Okay.
I'm just asking, just a comment that I have your book, Terrorism and Tyranny, and before I even read it, it said inside the back cover, your work has been condemned by the FBI, the NSA, et cetera, et cetera. I said, boy, that's a pretty good endorsement. Thank
Thanks.
you very much.
Yeah, I've tried to get a lot of mileage out of that over the years. Cynthia.
Hi, nice hat.
Well, see, the reason I was wearing the hat is because it's on the book cover, and I was thinking it doesn't quite go with the shirt.
No, very, very hobo.
Very hobo. Well, you know, what the hell? I was raised in the hills.
What you brought up earlier about maybe the rhetoric of some of the right-wing establishment and how it allowed some of the journalists to go up against them a bit more. What about like the velvet hammer as far as the rhetoric of maybe the current administration seems softer, but they're actually doing worse things? So how do you talk to journalists or journalism majors about seeing through the velvet hammer of the current administration? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, some people can get a pass because of what they look like or what they're saying, but they're actually doing worse things. And so it can get pretty dangerous if people aren't going to report or talk about these things just because of that.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I'm just curious. I was wondering, as far as the velvet hammer, does that include the drone strikes?
No, it's just rhetoric. It's appearance and rhetoric.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's a frustrating thing. I've done stories over the last year or so looking at things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And the EEOC has issued this new rule that is trying to make it a crime for businesses to do background checks on job applicants. And what the EEOC says is, well, that's a disparate impact on blacks and Hispanics because they have a much higher rate of being ex-convicts, like 700% in one case. And so what the EEOC is trying to do is destroy the freedom to hire and fire in this country because it has an adverse effect on people who happen to be ex-convicts. And this is something which has gotten very little coverage. I did a story for this in the Wall Street Journal. EEOC didn't like it. But this is the perfect example. I mean, I'm surprised that the conservative press has not done a better job of highlighting the power grabs of the Obama administration. And part of it is on things like the drone attacks, on the surveillance. A lot of the conservative press think, well, you know, not that, you know, I'm mystified why so many conservatives and Republicans don't recognize that the NSA is spying on them. You know, it's just like, yo, dude, it's the opposition party controlling the NSA. They're reading your emails. Do you think something bad could happen from that?
That tool later down the line.
Yes, that's part of it. But part of it too is I've been appalled at how much of the mainstream media and the liberal media has just kind of shrugged off Obama's power grabs and abuses, like the stuff he's doing on Obamacare. Well, that part of the law, 2 years. This part, 5 years. Whatever. I mean, presidents can't do this kind of shit. I mean, okay, presidents can do interpretations and stuff like that, but it's wholesale, and it's more dramatic. People got very upset that George W. Bush would do signing statements and say, well, this and this provision of the law I don't like, so it's unconstitutional, so I'm not going to obey it. That was outrageous. What Obama is doing, he's doing that with entire statutes, like on immigration, I think the Federal Defense of Marriage thing, Act, which, I mean, it might be that he's on the right side of these issues, or it might not be, but as soon as you say that the president can pick and choose which laws will be enforced, then you have a dictator. And it's disappointing that more people have not made a connection, because Obama's far more threatening than what most people realize. And I should do a book on that.